Hello, test, yes. So, hello ladies and gentlemen, I hope you're all doing good. Today is just another day, and I will be reading to you some... Hello ladies and gentlemen, today is another day and I will be reading to you Peter Pan by Sir James Barrie. Hope you will enjoy this reading, and if you do, well, leave a comment, a like, and come back. If you ask your mother whether she knew about Peter Pan when she was a little girl, she will say, "Why, of course I did, child." And if you ask her whether he rode on a goat in those days, she will say, "What a foolish question to ask. Certainly he did." Then if you ask your grandmother whether she knew about Peter Pan when she was a girl, she also says, "Why, of course I did, child." But if you ask her whether he rode on a goat in those days, she says she never heard of his having a goat. Perhaps she has forgotten, just as she sometimes forgets your name and calls you Mildred, which is your mother's name. Still, she could hardly forget such an important thing as the goat. Therefore, there was no goat when your grandmother was a little girl. This shows that in telling the story of Peter Pan, to begin with, the goat, as most people do, is as silly as to put your jacket before your vest. Of course, it also shows that Peter is ever so old, but he is really always the same age. So that does not matter in the least. His age is 1 week, and though he was born so long ago, he has never had a birthday, nor is there the slight. His age is 1 week, and though he was born so long ago, he has never had a birthday, nor is there the slightest chance of his ever having one. The reason is that he escaped from being a human when he was 7 days old. He escaped by the window and flew back to the Kensington Gardens. If you think he was the only baby who ever wanted to escape, it shows how completely you have forgotten your own young days. When David heard this story first, he was quite certain that he had never tried to escape. But I told him to think back hard, pressing his hand to his temples, and when he had done this hard and even harder, he distinctly remember a youthful desire to return to the treetops. And with that memory came others, as that he had lain in bed planning to escape as soon as his mother was asleep. And with that memory came others, as that he had lain in bed planning to escape as soon as his mother was asleep, and how she had once got him halfway up the chimney. All children could have such recollection if they would press their hand hard to their temples, for having been birds before they were humans, they are naturally a little wild during the first few weeks, and very itchy at the shoulders where their wings used to be. So David tells me. I ought to mention here that the following is our way with a story. First I tell it to him, and then he tells it to me. The understanding being that it is quite a different story, and then I retell it with his additions, and so we go on until no one could say whether it is more his story or mine. In this story of Peter Pan, for instance, the bold narrative and most of the moral reflection are mine, though not all, for this boy can be a stern moralist. But the interesting bits about the ways and customs of baby in the bird stage are mostly reminiscent of David's recalled by pressing his hand to his temple and thinking hard. Well, Peter Pan got out by the window, which had no bars. Standing on the ledge, he could see trees far away, which were doubtless the Kensington Gardens. And the moment he saw them, he entirely forgot that he was now a little boy in a nightgown, and away he flew, right over the house to the gardens. It is wonderful that he could fly without wings. It is wonderful that he could fly without wings. But the place itched tremendously, and perhaps we could all fly if we were as dead confident sure of our capacity to do it, as was bold Peter Pan that evening. He alighted gaily on the open sward between the baby's palace and the Serpentine, and the first thing he did was to lie on his back and kick. He was quite unaware already that he had ever been human, and though he was a bird, even in appearance just the same as in his early days. And when he tried to catch a fly, he did not understand that the reason he missed it was because he had attempted to seize it with his hand, which of course a bird never does. He saw, however, that it must be past lockout time, for there were a good many fairies about, all too busy to notice him. They were getting breakfast ready, milking their cows, drawing water, and so on. And the sight of the water pails made him thirsty, so he flew over to the round pond to have a drink. He stooped and dipped his beak in the pond. He thought it was his beak, but of course it was only his nose, and therefore very little water came up, and that not so refreshing as usual. So next he tried a paddle, and he fell flop into it. When a real bird falls in flop, he spreads out his feathers and He spreads out his feathers and pecks them dry. But Peter could not remember what was the thing to do, and he decided rather sulkily to go to sleep on the whipping beach in the baby walk. At first, he found some difficulty in balancing himself on a branch, but presently he remembered the way and fell asleep. He awoke long before morning, shivering, and saying to himself, "I never was out on such a cold night." He had really been out on colder nights when he was a bird, but, of course, as everybody knows, what seems a warm night to a bird is a cold night to a boy in night gown. Peter also felt strangely uncomfortable, as if his head was stuffy. He heard loud noises that made him look round sharply, though they were really himself sneezing. There was something he wanted very much, but though he knew he wanted it, he could not think what it was. What he wanted so much was his mother to blow his nose. But that never struck him, so he decided to appeal to the fairies for enlightenment. They are reputed to know a good deal. There were two of them strolling along the baby walk with their arms round each other's waist, and he hopped down to address them. The fairies have their tiffs. With the birds, but they usually give a civil answer to a civil question, and he was quite angry when these two ran away the moment they saw him. Another was lolling on a garden chair reading a postage stamp which some human had let fall, and when he heard Peter's voice he popped in alarm behind a tulip. To Peter's bewilderment, he discovered that every fairy he met fled from him. A band of workmen who were sawing down a toadstool rushed away, leaving their tools behind them. A milkmaid turned her pail upside down and hid in it. Soon the gardens were in an uproar. Crowds of fairies were running this way and that, asking each other stoutly who was afraid. Lights were extinguished, doors barricaded, and from the ground of Queen's Mab Palace came the rub-a-tub of drum, showing the royal guard had been called out. A regiment of lancers came charging down the broad walk, armed with holly leaves, with which they shagged the enemy horribly in passing. Peter heard the little people crying everywhere that there was a human in the garden after lockout time. But he never thought for a moment that he was the human. He was feeling stuffier and more wistful to learn what he wanted done to his nose. But he pursued them with the vital question in vain. The timid creature ran from him, and even the lancers, when he approached them up the hump, turned swiftly into a sidewalk on the pretense that they saw him there. Despairing of the fairies, he resolved to consult the birds, but now he remembered as an odd thing that all the birds on the weeping beach had flown away when he alighted on it. And though this had not troubled him at the time, he saw its meaning now. Every little thing was shunning him. Poor little Peter Pan. He sat down and cried, and even then he did not know that for a bird he was sitting on his wrong part. It is a blessing that he did not know, for otherwise he would have lost faith in his power to fly. And the moment you doubt whether you can fly, you cease forever to be able to do it. The reason birds can fly and we can't is simply that they have perfect faith, for to have faith is to have wings. No, except by flying, no one can reach the island in the Serpentine, for the boats of humans are forbidden to land there, and there are stakes round it, standing up in the water, on each of which a bird sentinel sits by day and night. It was to the island that Peter now flew, to put his strange case before old Solomon Cow, and he alighted on it with relief, much heartened to find himself at last at home, as the birds called the island. All of them were asleep, including the sentinel, except Solomon, who was wide awake on one side, and he listened quietly to Peter's adventure and then told him their true meaning. Look at your nightgown, if you don't believe me, Solomon said, and with staring eyes Peter looked at his nightgown and then at the sleeping bird. No, not one of them wore anything. How many of you toes are dumps? Said Solomon, a little cruelly, and Peter saw to his consternation that all his toes were fingers. The shock was so great that it drove away his cold. Ruffle your feathers, said that grim old Solomon, and Peter tried most desperately hard to ruffle his feathers, but he had none. Then he rose up quaking, and for the first time since he stood on the window ledge, he remembered a lady who had been very fond of him. I think I shall go back to Mother, he said timidly. Goodbye, replied Solomon Cow, with a queer look. But Peter hesitated. Why don't you go? The old one asked politely. I suppose, said Peter huskily, I suppose I can still fly? You see, he had lost faith. Poor little half and half, said Solomon. Who was not really hard-hearted. You will never be able to fly again, not even on windy days. You must live here on the island always, and never even go to the Kensington Garden, Peter asked tragically. How could you get across? Said Solomon. He promised very kindly, however, to teach Peter as many of the bird ways as could be learned by one of such awkward shape. Then I shan't be exactly a human? Peter asked. No. Nor exactly a bird? No. What shall I be? You will be a betwixt and between, Solomon said, and certainly he was a wise old fellow, for that is exactly how it turned out. The birds on the island never got used to him. His oddities tickled them every day, as if they were quite new, though it was really the birds that were new. They came out of the eggs daily and laughed at him at once. Then off they soon flew to be humans. And other birds came out of other eggs, and so it went on forever. The crafty mother birds, when they tired of sitting on the eggs, used to get the young ones to break their shell a day before the right time by whispering to them that now was their chance to see Peter washing or drinking or eating. Thousands gathered round him daily to watch him do these things, just as you watch the peacock, and they screamed with delight when he lifted the crust they flung him with his hands, instead of in the usual way with the mouth. All his food was brought to him from the garden at Solomon's order by the birds. He would not eat worms or insects, which they thought very silly of him. So they brought him bread in their beaks. Thus, when you cry out, "Greedy, greedy," to the bird that flies away with big crust, you know now that you ought not to do this, for he is very likely taking it to Peter Pan. Peter wore no nightgown now. You see, the birds were always begging him for bits of it to line their nest with, and being very good-natured, he could not refuse. So, by Solomon's advice, he had hidden what was left of it. But though he was now quite naked, you must not think that he was cold or unhappy. He was usually very happy and gay, and the reason was that Solomon had kept his promise and taught him many of the bird ways. To be easily pleased, for instance, and always to be really doing something. And to think that whatever he was doing was a thing of vast importance. Peter became very clever at helping the birds to build their nest. Soon he could build better than a wood pigeon, and nearly as well as a blackbird, though never did he satisfy the finches, and he made a nice little water trough near the nest and dug up worms for the young ones with his finger. He also became very learned in bird lore, and knew and knew an east wind from a west wind by its smell, and he could see the grass growing and hear the insects walking about inside the tree trunks. But the best thing Solomon had done was to teach him to have a glad heart. All birds have glad hearts, unless you robbed a nest, and so as they were the only kind of heart Solomon knew about, it was easy to him to teach Peter how to have one. Peter's heart was so glad that he felt he must sing all day long, just as the birds sing for joy. But being partly human, he needed an instrument, so he made a pipe of reeds, and he used to sit by the shore of the island of an evening, practicing the sough of the wind and the ripple of the water, and catching handfuls of the shine of the moon, and he put them all in his pipe and played them so beautifully that even the birds were deceived, and they would say to each other, "Was that a fish leaping in the water, or was it Peter playing leaping fish on his pipe?" And sometimes he played the bird of birds, and then the mother would turn round in their nest to see whether they had laid an egg. If you are a child of the gardens, you must know the chestnut tree near the bridge, which comes out in flower first of all the chestnut. But perhaps you have not heard why this tree leads the way. It is because Peter wearies for summer and plays that it has come, and the chestnut, being so near, hears him and is cheated. But as Peter sat by the shore tottling divinely on his pipe, he sometimes fell into sad thoughts, and then the music became sad also, and the reason of all this sadness was that he could not reach the gardens, though he could see them through the arc of the bridge. He knew he could never be a real human again, and scarcely wanted to be one. But oh, how he longed to play as other children play, and of course there is no such lovely place to play in as the gardens. The birds brought him news of how boys and girls play, and wistful tears started in Peter's eyes. Perhaps you wonder why he did not swim across. The reason was that he could not swim. He wanted to know how to swim, but no one on the island knew the way except the duck, and they are so stupid. They were quite willing to teach him, but all they could say about it was, "You sit down on the top of the water in this way, and then you kick out like that." Peter tried it often, but always before he could kick out, he sank. What he really needed to know was how you sit on the water without sinking, and they said it was quite impossible to explain such an easy thing as that. Occasionally swans touched on the island, and he would give them all his day's food and then ask them how they sat on the water. But as soon as he had no more to give them, the hateful things hissed at him and sailed away. Once he really thought he had discovered a way of reaching the gardens. A wonderful white thing, like a runaway newspaper, floated high over the island and then tumbled, rolling over and over after the manner of a bird that has broken its wings. Peter was so frightened that he hid, but the bird told him it was only a kite, and what a kite is, and that it must have tugged its string out of a boy's hand and soared away. Peter was so frightened that he hid, but the bird told him it was only a kite, and what a kite is, and that it must have tugged its string out of a boy's hand and soared away. After that, they laughed at Peter for being so fond of the kite. He loved it so much that he even slept with one hand on it. And I think this was pathetic and pretty, for the reason he loved it was because it had belonged to a real boy. To the birds, this was a very poor reason, but the older ones felt grateful to him at this time because he had nursed a number of fledglings through the Germans' missiles, and they offered to show him how birds fly as a kite. So 6 of them took the end of the string in their beaks. So 6 of them took the end of the strings in their beaks and flew away with it. And to his amazement, it flew after them and went even higher than they. Peter screamed out, "Do it again!" And with great good nature they did it several times, and always instead of thanking them he cried, "Do it again!" which shows that even though he had not quite forgotten what it was to be a boy. At last, with a grand design burning within his brave heart, he begged them to do it once more with him clinging to the tail. And now 100 flew off with the string, and Peter clung to the tail, meaning to drop off when he was over the gardens. But the kite broke to pieces in the air, and he would have been drowned in the Serpentine had he not caught hold of 2 indignant swans and made them carry him to the island. After this, the birds said that they would help him no more in his mad enterprise. Nevertheless, Peter did reach the gardens, at last, by the help of Shelley's boat, as I am now to tell you.